why we are being miseducated and how we are being miseducated. This was a piece in the New York Times, the 18th of February, 1993. Teaching in a closet or a shower. Crowded classes and more students are a portent of the future. It is so crowded in some New York City public schools that some students get lunch at 10:30 a.m. Some attend classes in churches, empty warehouses, factories, even defunct department stores. Classes are taught in closets, and computer labs are converted shower stalls. And the problem is only getting worse. And they talk about the largest surge in enrollment in a quarter of a century in New York City schools. They indicate here that city public school enrollment peaked in 1971 with the record of 1,140,349 students as the city entered a period of stark decline and retrenchment. What are we saying here? The number of students that are entering New York City schools is increasing at the very point when New York City schools are becoming poverty-stricken, when the New York City school budgets are what? Decreasing and shrinking.
In his powerful lecture, The Failure of the Education System, Dr. Amos N. Wilson critiques the systematic miseducation of Black children in America and exposes the deeper motivations behind educational inequality. Wilson argues that the American educational system does not fail Black children by accident. It is intentionally structured to preserve white dominance and limit the development of Black potential. Rather than equipping Black students with knowledge and skills to empower themselves and their communities, the system offers them a curriculum devoid of relevance of their history, culture, and real-world needs. Wilson emphasizes that education in this country is less about learning and more about social conditioning, training Black children to accept their place at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. Wilson points out that many Black children attend severely underfunded and neglected schools, often staffed by underqualified teachers who are ill-equipped to nurture their students' intellectual growth. These substandard living environments lack essential resources like updated textbooks, functioning technology, and stimulating extracurricular programs. The growth in enrollment among Black children far exceeds the education system's willingness to fund adequate facilities, materials, or qualified personnel. As a result, rather than being educated to succeed, Black students are being warehoused and pushed through a system that expects little from them and prepares them for even less.
This is the school system that African American people have inherited. A school system that is becoming constricted and restricted in its financial possibilities. And yet at the very point that it is becoming constricted in its ability to finance our education, the number of students entering the system is increasing. Schools officials use the opportunity to close and dispose of outdated school buildings that they thought they would never need again. In other words, in the 70s, they thought that the decline in the population of New York City schools would continue. And so they closed the schools, they got rid of them because they thought they would never need them again. And now, lo and behold, what has happened? The population has increased and we have tremendous overcrowding. Much of the recent increase has been attributed to new immigrants who have been filling up public schools in some neighborhoods while seats in other neighborhoods go begging. Some of the growth is also because of the economic pressures on parents during a recession that has resulted in sagging enrollments in private and parochial schools. We are seeing a shrinking in the population of parochial schools, that is Catholic schools and other private schools. While enrollment in our schools continues to grow dramatically, our share of the state's allocation for education continues to shrink. This was stated by Mr. Fernandez, the outgoing chancellor. In the last 3 years, more than 125,000 immigrant children enrolled in city schools. The largest group came from the Dominican Republic, followed by Jamaica, the former Soviet Union. We're going to come back to this immigrant issue, by the way. The former Soviet Union. In other words, as the Soviet Empire broke down, A lot of the people are leaving that empire, including Soviet Jews and other European white folk, and coming to America. And of course, are being enrolled in New York City schools. They're also coming from Guyana, China, and Haiti. They note that between 1971 and 1991, enrollment in private or parochial schools fell by more than a third to 267,838 from 415,939. So the educational situation here is going to be one of great struggle between groups for shrinking resources. The struggle has been taking place since the very beginning between white and black, with the whites, of course, manipulating the budgets and manipulating the nature of education of African people to maintain their power relations and their dominance over African people. A relationship that they do not intend to give up. Let's compare some of the spending per student in the New York City area between 1986 and 1987. Manhasset, which is out on Long Island, the spending per student per year amounts to $11,372. That is between 86 and 87. Now look at how that compares with New York City during that period, which spent $5,585. In other words, on Long Island, in places where white students are, the state spends more than twice as much money per student than in New York City. This is how ethnic groups, this is how class groups maintain their advantage and maintain their power. Let's look again. Jericho, Long Island. Again, $11,325 per student. Great Neck, $11,000. Again, compare that now to the $5,000 figure I mentioned in New York City. Bronxville, $10,000. Yonkers, Rye, New York, $9,000. Yonkers, $7,000 per student. Levittown, $6,000. Mount Vernon, $6,000. Roosevelt, $6,000. Down to New York City, $5,000. It's no accident then that people coming from these areas, going to these schools, have an advantage over people coming out of the New York City schools. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're not aware of these facts, if you're not struggling in terms of the state allocations for educational funds, if you're not aware of how money is allocated in the state for education, then you're going to be victimized by those allocations. And as you can see, the allocations are weighted to maintaining the status quo. Let's look then again at how this gap has widened. Let's bring it more up to date. In terms of 1989 and 90, Manhasset, $15,000 per student. On Long Island again, Jericho, $14,000. Great Neck, $15,000. Now we're coming closer to home. Mount Vernon, $9,000. Roosevelt, $8,000. New York City, $7,000. So what are we indicating here then? That the ethnic and class struggle continues, and that ethnic and class struggle is such that those ethnic groups and those classes which can exercise political and economic power will bias the distribution of educational funds in such a way that their political and economic power is maintained. Now, those are the basic average figures. Now, you can go into particular areas such as Amagansett, Long Island, and you will recognize that there, the average amount of money spent per student in that area is something like $45,000 per student. Yes, you have these tremendous differences. And so you have students who are sitting in computer labs where a class is no more than about 20 people. And they got more than enough computers per student, where just the computer course itself, the catalog dealing with computer education amounts to 55 pages alone, just dealing with the computer education courses that they offer in their schools. So what do you got going on here? Ethnic groups, class groups using their power to maintain their power and to maintain their differences. So they'll let up on you a little bit. They'll give you a little head start and a little this, but in the end, there's no intention to give you any head start. There's no intention to even let you start out the race even at all. The question then becomes, if the nation no longer needs African people, will it continue to educate them? You see, the thing that we fail to ask ourselves, as indicated by Brother Patrick there, is what is the function of education? We think as African people that the major function of education is to prepare people for jobs. But you never ask yourself, what if the jobs do not exist? We assume that there is a job out there for every educated person, so that all we need to do is just get educated and reach out for the jobs and they'll just fall in our hands. But this is another myth. This is not the reality, ladies and gentlemen, of this country today. And it's seldom the reality of many nations. There are many nations and there are countries today where the supply of educated people far exceeds the number of jobs available for those people. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why we have a large number of immigrants in this country today is because there is little opportunity for educated immigrants in their own country. The average immigrant coming into this country today, in other words, I believe if my figures are not wrong, but they're in the ballpark, my last reading was that 46% of the immigrants coming into the United States today have college degrees. This compares with something like 18% of native-born blacks with college degrees. Understand? Even if you compare people coming from the Caribbean, I believe it is something like 30% Caribbean with college level education, as against something like 18 to 16% of native-born African American with college level education. And when you look at black males, you're comparing something like 30% of Caribbean educated people as against something like 13% African American males. So there's a major question that is buried in these statistics. And that situation is this: why should we educate African Americans when we can ship in educated people from other nations and other places? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because this is exactly what is going on and what is happening. But the more fundamental question is, if there are few jobs, or if there is a slow growth of jobs, do we need to continue to produce the same number or a larger number of educated people? If, as we argued earlier, education like welfare is used to regulate people and to regulate the country, then why, if whites did recognize that the number of jobs that are available do not exceed the number of educated people, why then would not the system decide that it's going to do what? Cut back on the number of educated people, even though it will hide that behind a lot of mystical ideas that they're dropping out on their own, that they don't have ambition, that, they come from the wrong class background, or they come from the projects and all that other stuff. But in the end, no matter how they explain it, there will be fewer of us getting education, and therefore fewer of us to compete with the others. Even if this country needed the African American, could it educate him according to standard methods? You see, that is, we are beginning to run into the situation where the country could say, yes, we could possibly. I'm speaking hypothetically because this is not the reality. You could say hypothetically that, yes, we may need more African Americans in the labor market and we should bring more of them in. A major question becomes then, can these schools really appropriately educate African people, particularly when these schools are based on another model? And these schools are not designed to meet the educational needs of African American people, or designed to meet the psychology and history of African American people so that we could be appropriately educated in them. To a great extent, I've said on many other occasions, these schools and this school that you sit in right now never was designed with the idea that you would be the majority in mind in it. This school still operates on the model of the white child. Its whole structure, its teaching approach, in fact, its very physical design, its very values and language structures and so forth, is based on students who are no longer in the school at all. It's based on the white middle-class child. And the very fact that it is based on that child, it is based on the developmental psychology of that child, means that it is mismatched with the psychology that our children enter in its doors with. In a sense, then, there's a built-in failure in the very design of the school itself, in that this school, being based on the developmental psychology of white children, being based on the linguistic orientation of white children, on the value orientations of white children, on the intentionalities of white children, but not only on white children, but white people in general, is a school then that cannot meet the needs of the African and other children in it. And the major question then is America and is New York City willing to change the structure of these schools so that it can actually appropriately educate our children? What is the appropriate education for our children? Is there any need, actually, for these schools to actually be changed to better educate our people, if there's not much need for our people in the workforce? So is the struggle that we are having trying to bring in so-called multicultural education, African-centered education, really a struggle that is prolonged, not because the other side does not understand the value of that education, but maybe because the other side actually does understand it? And maybe because when we talk about preparing our children to compete equally or better than the other people, the other people actually do not want this to occur, and therefore get us caught up in long and drawn out struggles. What are the alternatives to educating African Americans? I've just mentioned the major alternatives. The major alternatives to educating our people is to ship in educated people from elsewhere, and therefore forget about the funding and the true education of Black people, and make school a big babysitting operation and let you hang in here until you drop out and then blame yourself for not continuing. There is a major deception then among Black people that education alone is going to solve our problems as a people, and that opportunity exists out there, and all we need to do is just have the drive and the will and the qualifications to get there. And we have a lot of baloney and propaganda in our community being perpetrated and propagated along these lines. If you look here last month, you will see in Black Enterprise magazine a cover story under the title, "The 40 Most Powerful Black Executives in the United States." I mean, a real farce, a total deception. Here are these high-class servants, supposedly representing powerful people, who could be laid off tomorrow with the snap of a finger. And is this the ideal of African people, that African men and women end up being second bananas to white folk and then look at themselves as representing powerful positions? What about those black executives who own something and who control something? What are 40 powerful executives anyway? In what way have these 40 powerful executives changed your life? Have they put an added nickel in your pocket? Have they given you an additional job? Then how is their elevation representing the elevation of black folk? What are 40 men and women out of 35 or 40 million men and women? There are 35 to 40 million black people in this country, ladies and gentlemen. It's probably 50 million. So are we going to then fall for the deception that 40 black folk in second banana jobs implies great advancement for Negro people in America? What if we had black executives over all of the Fortune 500 companies? What does that mean within the context of 40 million black folk? But you see, we got a bunch of people here who want to make you think that their getting a job represents an advancement for the race. The greatest measure of advancement for the race is the movement of average people into jobs, not the movement of a small elite. But what is it doing for the average person? It is an insult in this system anyway that an 8th grade or 9th grade educated person can't get a good job. See, we accept this as writ. The idea that if you got an 8th grade education, 9th grade education, you're supposed to starve to death. Where is that written in concrete? What kind of nation is it that will project this kind of mythology? That simply because you don't finish high school, or simply because you only finish high school, you're supposed to work for a poverty wage. But we've sort of bought into this concept and this idea. Now let's look quickly here then at the number of black folk who are making $50,000 and above. You know, that would include these great executives, right? You know what percentage of black people earn $50,000 and over? 15% of the black population. Only 15% of this 40 million people. 14 earn between $35,000 and $50,000, 14%. 14% earn between $25,000 and $35,000. 18 between 15 and 25,000, 11 between 10 and 14 and 15,000, and 15% between 5 and 9,000. In other words, 15% of the people are below the official poverty line, with 11% making under 5,000 a year. So we must look at progress in terms of where the average person, where these people between, let's say, 25,000 and below moving. And are those people moving? Not this small percentage that may be getting above $50,000 a year. Be very careful. J.C. Smith, an author, made the following statement: the most efficient way to maintain power is to give a little where it shows a lot. Thus, the system only removes some of the most obvious forms of exploitation and abuse. What are we talking about here? We're talking about tokenism. In other words, this nation can get a lot of mileage out of appointing 40 executives to positions, to high-profile positions in its industrial structure, and have black people then to see the appointment of these 40 people as representing progress for the whole race. This is what we mean by saying what? give a little where it shows a lot. Okay, we'll give you a few positions, and they're high-profile positions, and therefore you're overwhelmed by people being in this position, and you're fed with the false hope then that these positions and all the other positions that we don't have are now open and available to us as a people. You must recognize in my last reading that there's something like 17 million businesses in America. And to have 40 executives or even 500 executives, black executives, or to have 5,000 black executives is almost an unmeasurable number in amongst 17 million businesses. And if at last count, if my memory serves me, there's something like 77,000 black businesses. So again, you can realize the tremendous economic gap between black folk and so-called white folk and other folk in this system. However, the appointing of these black executives in these high-profile positions helps to deceive us and helps us buy into the ideology of individualism. The idea is that these black executives are in these positions because they study hard at night, and because they came from the right families, and because their mothers supported them, another kind of stupidity that we hear day in and day out. And therefore, we will not question the class structure of this system. We will not question the ethnic structure of the system. We will not structure the nature of power relations. We will not structure the intentions of Europeans to continue to maintain control over our lives. What the European has done essentially then is to blind us to the reality that their control over our lives and their control over the world is as strong, if not stronger, as it ever was, by appointing a few black people in high-profile positions, and to feed the rest of us with vain hopes that we one day will be among those few appointees, and to therefore deceive us into supporting the ideology of individualism, each one doing his own thing, that we do not have to operate as a race and as a collective group, and we do not have to operate on the basis of a common African identity, that we do not have to operate on the basis of a nation within a nation and as a people against other people, that all we have to do is pursue our own individual interests, and we will therefore make it. This is a major deception. It is very important that we face the reality of America today and face the reality of the world today. More so than that, it is very important that we face the reality of our own situation as African Americans. I've talked in other arenas about what I call the crisis of white supremacy. One of the reasons we don't worry too much as an African people, even when we are doing badly, and even when I'm talking the way I'm talking today, is it is very difficult for many African people to perceive the white man as not being in control of the world. Yeah. You know, we've seen so many movies where white boys win all the time. We've seen so many sitcoms where in 30 minutes a white boy figures out a way to save the day. We've seen so many white Supermen and Spider-Men and all these other kinds of men who are able to save Gotham from criminals and stuff, until we have been subliminally indoctrinated with the idea that white folk will always be on top. Many of us do not recognize that white folk will not always be on top and have not always been on top. That the white man on the so-called top has only been there for about 500 years out of the millions of years man has existed on this globe. And that the black man has been on top for thousands of years longer than the white man will ever know. But for people who don't know their own history, and for people who don't read history, for people who get their knowledge from cartoons and from sitcoms and from TV, you will never be aware of this. And so there are those among us, particularly those who live in America, who believe that since we live among the top white folk in the world, they will always stay on top and they will always hand us a crust of bread. There will always be welfare. And yet Clinton today is telling you that he's going to sweep you off of welfare after 2 years on it. And that one of the major programs that the Republicans are crying out for and other people are crying out for cutting are welfare programs. If you look at some of the states across this country, such as California, Michigan, and other states, you will see welfare programs and other what we call government transfer programs, where money is transferred from the government to people in poverty. They have been declining over the past decade or so. Poor people are getting poorer in America, not better in America. As a matter of fact, we have as many, if not more now, poor people in America as we had in the early 1970s. Poverty has actually increased and is increasing to the point of where we initiated a war on poverty at the end in the middle 1960s. When you look at the number of African American children in poverty, the number of African American children who live in poverty today is the same as the number that lived in poverty in 1949.
Adding another layer to the crisis, Wilson highlights the growing competition Black students face from children of immigrant families. These immigrant students often arrive in America better educated and without the psychological burdens that centuries of racism have imposed on Black Americans. They can compete more effectively for the already scarce educational and economic resources that Black children, despite their generational claim to this nation, have historically been denied. The narrative that immigrants are unskilled and uneducated is misleading. Many come prepared and capable, further squeezing Black students out of opportunities. Wilson makes a profound observation. The education system's failure is directly tied to the economic role, or lack thereof, that Black labor plays in modern American society. He raises a chilling question. If America no longer needs Black labor in the same capacity, or at all, why should it bother to properly educate Black children? In a society driven by capitalist logic, education is not provided out of morality or fairness, but rather to serve the needs of the economic system. If Black people are not seen as economically essential, then providing them with quality education becomes, from the system's perspective, unnecessary. Ultimately, Dr. Wilson challenges Black communities to confront the harsh truth. The American education system is not broken. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. He calls for a radical rethinking of what education should mean for Black people. True education must be designed by and for Black communities rooted in self-determination, cultural awareness, and empowerment. Only then can the cycle of miseducation be broken and Black children be prepared not just to survive in society, but to transform it.